I was starting, I suppose, I didn't know it, but starting to realize that humor was a good substitute for, well, actually, it was quite a good substitute for height, um, and a good substitute later on for not having a girlfriend, um, and is generally sort of part of one's armory, for want of a better expression.
Welcome to the Humourology Podcast with me, Paul Barros. And this is where we explore the art and humour in business and life. My guest on this edition of the Humourology Podcast is a pioneering figure in the world of speakers, events and ideas. After starting out booking talent into bingo halls and holiday camps, he went on to found the speaker agency JLA in 1990, which grew to become the UK's leading speaker bureau. Over the years, he's worked with extraordinary people and an extraordinary range of personalities, from comedians and broadcasters to politicians, explorers and business leaders. Along the way, he's heard more than his fair share of remarkable stories from the speaking circuit. More recently, having stepped back from the agency he built, he has launched the podcast Just Between Us, where he chats with many of the speakers and personalities he's worked with over the years. Jeremy Lee, welcome to the Humourology Podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. And do you know how irritating it is when you introduce somebody and the first thing they say is a correction? And so I do so in the spirit of I don't know, friendliness, and perhaps a little bluntness, because I don't know why this should be important to me, but we actually I started off the agency very much in comedy, and we were capitalizing, although I don't think I knew I was that clever at the time. In other words, I don't think I was being clever. But there was this thing that you will recall that for some years had been known as alternative comedy, and you were about to say you were a fundament of that.
I was in the midst of all that. I had two acts, Morris Minor and the Majors and the Calypso Twins, in the midst of all that.
Both of which I remember with something approaching affection. And anyway, 1990, people had begun to drop the word alternative because you lot had started to grow up and have mortgages and worry about where your kids were going to be educated. And you had nothing funny to say. Not that it was ever your shtick, Paul, but as a group, you had nothing new to say about Thatcher. And so it was just comedy. And I realized that that actually there was a market for it, because lo and behold, the corporate world, and by the way, I'm sure we'll get on to talk about the corporate world, but in those days, you know, I was very pro the corporate world. And I'll leave that hanging just so that you can kind of wonder where I might go to later. And I realized, or it so happened, whichever way, the corporate world, first of all, as it always did and always will, were keen on being seen to be in the vanguard of things. So what used to be called alternative comedy was good for them. Secondly, because they were mired in recession, they didn't want to spend a great deal of money. And thirdly, in what I think I'm going to call the early days of sort of consciousness about reputation from a corporate point of view, they didn't want to be seen or seem to be spending a lot of money on entertainers. So even if somebody was going to cost them more than Bob Monkhouse, the people in the crowd and anybody looking on from a distance wouldn't possibly imagine that to be the case. So it just so happened that all those things came together, and there was a ready market even while the country was bemoaning the state of the economy and everything like that. And only about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years later, did we realize that we had an opportunity to do what we had effectively done with comedy with the speaker circuit, which until that point had been set in aspic. There were a few names that, one or two of your older listeners, check me if I start using that phrase again and again. I'm certainly very conscious of it with my own podcast. But there were people like Lance Percival, who's actually a really nice chap, and Derek Nimmo.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And they were making a few bob on the speaking circuit, but there was very little else going on, while, as it turned out, a great deal was going on in America. So what we were doing, unbeknown to me, was beginning to follow that huge growth in paying for talent to come and speak to invited audiences. And we found ourselves in an industry that was mushrooming, just as we never lost touch, but we sidelined the other thing that was mushrooming, which was comedy. And that was because I was frightened by it when Newman and Baddiel, if I've got the right partnership,
Yes.
were starting to fill up Wembley, whatever it was. It wasn't Wembley Stadium.
It was Wembley Arena. That's right. Yeah.
They were starting to sell that out, and whichever git it was referred to comedy as the new rock and roll. And you'd have thought I would go, oh, that's fantastic. We're in the comedy business. We're in and getting to be a fairly significant part alongside, the likes of Addison Cresswell and John Thoday, the business of comedy. And I thought to myself, oh, God, no, new rock and roll, that sounds dreadful. That's like fashion. I hate fashion, because what it means is that tomorrow will be yesterday's rock and roll. So my brain took us more and more in the direction of speakers while continuing to work with comedians. And you referred to us as a speaker bureau. And now, in fact, the people who now own the company sort of trumpet that all over the place. But I never, ever, ever did. Because to me, what we were about was variety in all its senses, from stand-up comedy through presenters, most of whom add bugger all to the equation, and to speakers, some of whom did have genuine value, and some of whom also relied on comedy. So that's the end of my correction. Shall we meet again in the next episode?
Exactly. Well, no, that was a perfect distillation of your career. But actually, I want to go back a stage before that, because I'd like to know a little bit more about you and where you come from. Where did you grow up, and what were those early years like? And was humor important in your family?
Well, let's deal with the last one first. My father was very funny. Not as in a gag teller, but he had a lovely sense of humor born of his and our Jewish background. And I mean, I've said this all over the place. So if you've already heard this, listener, then here he goes again. But Hugo Rifkin
Yes.
wrote a column in The Spectator. I no longer read The Spectator any more than I read any other national newspaper. I think they should all be consigned to the bin. But Hugo came up with a phrase that I very much took to heart when he described himself, excuse me, as a Jewish Church of England agnostic. And that's what I am. And the family humor, my humor, I suppose, very much stems from the Jewish part of that. I'll tell you one thing, and I'm struggling to remember where I told this story. No, I'll stop apologizing. I don't regurgitate the same stories everywhere, trust me. My father told me as a child, you might or might not know this, Paul, Jewish people have something stuck on their door frame. You know where I'm going with this?
Yeah, is it a missile?
It's called, I could just sit here and watch you squirm, but it's called a mezuzah.
Mezuzah, there you go.
Yep. It contains, I think, a bit of script, I think from the Talmud, it's some religious scripture. Yeah. But my father had always told me otherwise. And the last time I heard him say this was when I bought a flat very, very long time ago. And and I was showing my parents in, and we walked through the door, and he looked up and he saw the mezuzah, and he said, "Do you know what that is?" He didn't actually sound as, inverted commas, Jewish as I just made him sound. He said, "Do you know what that is?" And I said, "Of course I know what it is." He said, "It's a mezuzah." And I said, "I know." And he said, "You know what's inside it?" And I said, "No, what's inside it?" And he said, "It's a little message." And I said, "Oh?" He said, "Yeah, it's a message saying, 'Help, I'm stuck inside the mezuzah factory.'" And that is a way into the kind of humor or the atmosphere in which I was brought up, which we might get on to talk about, because in these days, characterized as woke, or in my view, in certain circumstances, ultra woke, it might be seen as iffy. I mean, it's not iffy for me as a Jewish person to tell that story, but it's iffy to tell stories about so-called minorities. And my view is that actually humor must do that. It must embrace, very gently, but it must embrace stereotypes. Anyway, so I was brought up with that kind of stereotypical Jewish humor. You look as though you're going to say something.
No, it's because I'm the son of a Hungarian refugee, so we have Jewish genes and Jewish blood, if you like. Do you think that caution can sometimes make communication less interesting or even less honest?
Yes, of course. What I would characterize as ultra woke laws are well intentioned. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be a real git to be against social justice. Yeah. I'm
Yes.
for just to sort of head this off. I am a muscular centrist. I am as appalled by extremes on left and right. So, however this came about, whether it was you want to characterize it as a leftist thing or whatever, it was certainly embraced by politicians of all colours on both sides of the Atlantic. And what's happened is that whole generations have been taught to believe that it's a cardinal sin to say anything that might offend anyone. And so now we have laws, we have a prohibition on saying or doing things that might cause offense. And one of the worst things you can say is anything to do with a stereotype. So the problem is this: stereotypes, as you just acknowledged, and it's blindingly fucking obvious. I should have said, Paul, I should have apologized to your listeners in advance, that as well as chain smoking, I also swear quite a lot. Am I okay to take this as therapy? Does your podcast?
100%. I'm a psychologist. Yeah, please, this
Excellent.
is your free hour.
I'm very happy with that. Don't send me the bill afterwards. So we need stereotypes, right? They're part of our identity. They're part of what makes us who we are, as you just said. And they're also how we recognize and relate to one another, I would argue. In the context of this, of the Humourology podcast, they are an absolutely intrinsic part of our humor. And stereotypes don't have to be offensive. Yeah. I mean, just in case there's anybody listening who thinks, I am in favor of a free-for-all. No, I'm definitely not. What we had before these regulations, which of course are all wrapped up in more wide-ranging anti-discrimination laws and all of that. They don't exist on their own and for their own sake. What we had before wasn't actually a free-for-all. It was, and I'm not going back that far, it was an understanding. It was a bit like an unwritten constitution, which told us what was and wasn't acceptable. And very importantly, it shifted over time according to what, we, brackets, society, question mark, close brackets, generally deemed reasonable. Mm-hmm. But now that's gone, we have something that's codified. It worked before precisely because it wasn't codified. Yep. Now we have a set of laws, and you have unintended consequences like you do with almost any law. So the upshot of that is, in the context of comedy, I think it means ordinary people, which means all of us, start to lose the ability openly to laugh at ourselves and each other. And the key word there is openly. Yeah. I mean,
Yes.
a comedy built on stereotypes will always go on, but it's healthy if it's open, and it's probably less healthy if it's purely behind closed doors. And then just to go away from, because you can tell I'm on a rant. Sorry, listener, just wind forward. Beyond comedy, what really gets me is this, and which is why I used the word corrosive earlier on. Beyond comedy, and the bloody awful consequence of all this, is that laws against causing offence allow unlimited potential, and it was the point you were making, unlimited potential for taking offence.
Yes.
And the upshot of that is that innocuous stereotypes and things like that are seen as a serious attack and then leave us with a vast new class of victims.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing we don't read right now, it's victims. It's victimhood. That is a desire. It's not just bad for, inverted commas, productivity. It's bad for civilization.
Well, it's bad for integration.
It's bad for integration
because if we're not starting with the humourology concept of we are all ridiculous, we have to be able to play with that notion. It's funny because we had a couple of years ago, we had Jimmy Mulville on the podcast, and Jimmy was talking on a very similar plane. He said what really drives him crazy these days is he'll have a sitcom and there will be, say, a sexist character or a racist character who gets their comeuppance. Before they won't allow that character to be shown having their comeuppance because they'll just X them out of the equation straight away. And so he goes, it's ridiculous because now everything becomes bland.
I couldn't agree with you more. There will be those who take an opposing position. I'd be perfectly happy to debate with them. But actually, Paul, come on. This is supposed to be a humourology podcast. We're supposed to be. I'm sorry, I'm not telling you how to run your podcast, but I'm feeling like I'm setting everybody on a bit of a downer. And
no, not at all. I don't know. Actually, no. The humourology is also about debating the facts, and I think the fact that you and Jimmy Mulville were coming from a similar tack is interesting. But let's go back to you. The Jesuits say, "Give me a child of 7, and I will give you the man." Well, I don't know how Jesuit you are.
I'm not. For the record, at all.
Was the young Jeremy Lee humorous? Were you cheeky? What were you like at 7 and at school?
I think lazy, facetious. I absolutely hated Hebrew classes on Sundays because I was I was sent to a posh-ish school, sort of first generation money. And nominally Church of England, although we had a very, very large proportion of Jews and a smaller proportion of Turkish Cypriots, which leads us absolutely nowhere apart from the fact that I know the man who is now president of the northern part of Cyprus. But anyway, so I went to this school, which meant going to chapel 6 days a week. And then, because I happened to be Jewish, I was sent to Hebrew classes and synagogue on the 7th day. So it's hardly bloody surprising. And I worship my parents. Please don't take this as a criticism. But it's hardly surprising that I came out feeling more comfortable in a chapel than I do in a synagogue. It's hardly bloody surprising. And I learned nothing in Hebrew classes. I bunked off. And actually, a story has just come to my mind. Do I want to tell you this? Is there a downside? Well, who cares? I had to do my bar mitzvah. Okay, so the confirmation thing when you're 13.
13 years old. Yep.
and you have to learn what they call a portion, yeah, and read it. Yeah. So you're up there, and the invited guests are looking at you, and you've got this bit of. No, I don't want to sound so dismissive. The trouble is, I can't remember what you call the bit of cloth that you have around you. Anyway, and you've got this golden pointer, and you've got the scripts, which are on a sort of roller in front of you. Yeah. And you read your portion. And my problem was that I couldn't read it. Yeah. I couldn't read any of these, so far as I was concerned, symbols. Yeah. I mean, like Arabic, like Chinese, like Sanskrit, whatever. They meant nothing to me. But I learnt the sounds. And not that I will. I can repeat the first line today because I found myself doing so the other day. I know I can. Anyway, so I then delivered this thing, which was about, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And the rabbi came up to me afterwards and he said, Jeremy, he didn't, to be honest, I can't remember what he sounded like. So he's going to sound like my rabbi. He said, Jeremy, he said, I have to congratulate you. I said, I had no idea you had it in you. He said, well done, but just tell me one thing. He said, why the French accent? So obviously the sounds that I'd learned came out with an entirely unintended and unknowing French accent. But so far as I was concerned, I had just done an act of delivering sounds that I'd heard for a few minutes. So in answer to your question, whenever you posed it last year sometime, about my upbringing, my childhood, I was very lazy. I couldn't be bothered to learn Hebrew. I was facetious. I was starting, I suppose, I didn't know it, but starting to realize that humor was a good substitute for, well, actually, it was quite a good substitute for height, and a good substitute later on for not having a girlfriend. And is generally sort of part of one's armory, for want of a better expression. But otherwise, a very happy family home, 3 siblings, and all of us a disappointment. Actually, no. My middle brother is not a disappointment. I'm referring to that other wonderful Jewish stereotype, which I think also applies in the world of Indian stereotypes. Certainly in a middle class context, where your dream is to achieve, every pun intended, the holy trinity of doctor, accountant, and lawyer.
Yes.
And we didn't. My middle brother was an accountant, but otherwise, the 3 boys and 1 girl, the 3 boys ended up pharmacist, agent, and accountant, which is nowhere near. I mean, it's a deep disappointment. So that's me. That's my background.
Do you remember the first time you became aware of the world of performers and comedians and speakers?
I was certainly grabbed by theatre when I was at school. I wasn't aware of anything called stand-up comedy, and I carried on not being aware of it pretty much until after college. I found myself booking talent for Mecca, that wonderful big entertainment entity that I've no idea whether it exists anymore or not. But anyway, I would start to be asked for stand-up comedians and things like that. But before that, actually, no, I suppose I was aware of stand-up as a student because I took shows to Edinburgh, and I saw acts like Pookie Snackenberger is one that comes to mind, and a number of other kind of what became important comedy acts going on, but I wasn't really aware of that. I was into theatre, and only later was I interested in comedy, and then later still did I get interested in speakers. But I wasn't interested in speakers um, in a sense that I'm being very honest now. I wasn't then interested in speakers in a sense that I thought they had as much value as other types of performer. I was very quick to realize that comedians have a great deal more value than actors because these days they're using their own material.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they might not have been in the days when Bob Monkhouse was writing for others and other people and John Junkin and Barry Cryer and all that crowd. But by the time they were writing their own material, that obviously gives them more heft and more respectability and more value than mere actors. But by the time speakers came into my life, I think the whole thing was about discovering something about which I knew virtually nothing. And 35 or so years later, I'm not sure whether I know a great deal more, but hey.
You've said that you only had two proper jobs, and the first involved booking talent into bingo halls and holiday camps. What did those kind of rooms teach you about audiences generally, which was useful later on?
For a while, I had to book holiday camps, which we weren't allowed to call holiday camps. Can't remember what we were allowed to call them. Holiday centres. I don't think we were allowed to use the word camp. One of the holiday camps for which I was responsible was used to film Heidi High. And the alarming thing is that each year they had to do it up and repaint it for Heidi High. So it was that much of a complete and utter pit. I mean, it was foul. And I went there in my early days with a far more experienced person in the office who rightly corrected me. Very, very rightly. It was a big lesson. Because, I was saying, well, I'm not staying here. How does anybody, in some sort of caravan on the site or whatever, how I don't understand this. How is any part of this anything to do with being on holiday? And she turned to me and said, well, do you know what this costs to stay at a week? And I said, I don't know. And she told me. And she said, there are quite a lot of people who can't afford any more than that. You think they shouldn't go on holiday? She wasn't Jewish. I apologize for that Jewish intonation. Yeah. And my goodness me, was that an important lesson. And another lesson about entertainment. So I put in an act from the circuit, as you and I would call it. Yeah. I honestly can't remember who it was. And I was there. It was on the Isle of Wight. And I stood at the back, as I always do. I'm probably like you. I always watch and listen to the audience. I've never really taken a great deal of notice about what's on stage, and almost never laugh, by the way, which is not deliberate. I mean, it's just how it turns out. And this couple were chattering during this act, and said, "Well, I don't know why he's here." So where's Terry, or whatever his name was? I think his name might have been Terry, actually. He said, where's the strong man?
Oh, God.
And at that point, I realized that this strong man act was actually quite a good act, which had been booked in there for that week every year, for time immemorial, or whatever the phrase was. Yeah. I, in my jumped up metropolitan idiocy, had seen fit not to book the strong man, but to put in this Ponzi act from the London comedy circuit, which I don't remember it dying, but I do remember it struggling and barely any applause at the end. And so that was a very big lesson, actually. It was more than one lesson. But it was don't preach to audiences, or think very carefully before you do. Don't dismiss something that they think is funny, and if you want and entertaining. And if you want to introduce something new, think about it first and do it very carefully. Don't impose your taste on them. And that was a hugely important lesson.
I think that's an important lesson in sort of life and business as well. Is, the first chapter in my first book, The Pitching Bible, was called It's All About Them. Because as a performer for years, and as somebody who's obviously spoken on a lot of corporate stages over the years, really, I have a theory that the meaning of your communication is the response you get. So you're the only one who's getting it wrong. And same as a booker, if you booked it wrong, it's all about the audience and what they want and what they need to that
Yeah,
extent.
yeah. And obviously I carried on for the next 35 years making mistakes, because you always do.
Yeah.
But every so often you learn a lesson like that and you grow up a little tiny bit. And
No,
and, and that was one of those moments, frankly. Can I tell you the story very quickly?
sure. No, I'd love it.
It's a true story. I used to look after a comic, a magician who you will have come across called John Lenahan.
I've worked with John over the
Indeed.
years.
Very, very, very funny man. And John and I were very, very close in those days. We were like brothers. And I often used to go out to gigs with him. And I went to his house in Cricklewood one day, parked the car, and walked up to his back gate. And his son, Finbar, now grown up, I think with a very high-powered job, was then, I don't know, 5 or 6. And Finbar saw me walking up the short garden path and apparently shouted out to John. He said, "Daddy, Daddy, your boss is here. Jeremy's here." Anyway, we got into the car and John told me the story, and I thought it was very funny. And I said, "Well, you better, you better put him straight." And he said, "Oh, don't worry." I said, "I'll do that." Anyway, about a month later, I turn up again and I park the car and I walk up towards the garden gate, and Finbar again, as though this were a made-up story, but it so isn't. Finbar apparently called out to his dad, John. He said, "Daddy, Daddy, Jeremy's here, your servant's here." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a brilliant way into understanding the relationship between artist and agent, because it will only work if it's neither of those things.
Yes.
I was asked to come up with my top 10 speaking tips some while ago for some interview or other. One of them was, don't tell jokes if you're not good at telling jokes.
By the way, I train people in speaking, and that's the first thing I always go to them and say, if you can't deliver a gag, don't try.
The other thing about starting any kind of speech or performance on stage, something I learned from Lenahan actually, is that you have to start with your best material. You can almost date that comment, that bit of advice, to being pre-2008, because he went on to say, and I won't do his accent, he went on to say, you have to start with a banker.
Yeah.
And until 2008, ladies and gentlemen, a banker
Yes.
was something different to what it is now.
Yes.
So if you can't tell a gag, then don't whatever you do drag up things from dictionaries of quotations. Don't ever say, that reminds me of something Oscar Wilde used to say, because you can bet your fucking bottom dollar it didn't remind him or her in any way of Oscar Wilde. And don't, even if you vaguely know how to tell a gag, don't go for a gag that everybody will have seen or heard. And on the corporate circuit, there were a couple of gags, which I doubt I can even remember now, but you'll have heard them. One is about the lighthouse keeper. Can you remember that?
No.
Okay, so this is Admiral is in whatever, the channel, and sees this light ahead of him, and radios ahead saying something like, please move.
Yes, we're coming through. Please move out
Exactly.
of the way.
And he comes back on the radio, you move. And then the original one says, I will not move. I am Admiral so-and-so of the such and such. You will move. And then it comes back, I'm Tom Jones of the such and such lighthouse. And that's the gag, okay? And, once upon a time, probably somewhere in the 19th century, that would have been a funny gag.
Yeah.
But in a corporate context, if you told that in my lifetime, everybody in the audience will have heard it, as they would have heard about the person who refuses the invitation to dance because it turns out he is not a woman, but the Cardinal Archbishop of Lima. Anyway, I mean, God, it's opening up a museum of gags, but they should never have been used. And I'm sure there are equivalents nowadays where you think, oh, well, I'll use that one. Well, don't. Yeah, don't. Bin it. And probably avoid gags altogether.
Well, yeah, and by the way, the best speakers I would warrant, and this is for people everybody who has to do a speech at a wedding or in a company away day or everything, the best ones, of course, and why people like William Hague are so good is because they can do something off the cuff as well. We had William on the show, and it's delightful. And funnily enough, the only person Tony Blair was afraid of, according to Alistair Campbell, who's done the show a couple of times, was William Hague, because of his ability to do the off-the-cuff gag, and it put them off balance. And humour is a weapon at that point.
Absolutely. First of all, I commend you for getting William onto your podcast before I've got in mine, even though I looked after him for 15 years. Actually, I'm saving William up because I want to do my podcast is called Just Between Us. I want to
do a brilliant podcast as well, listeners. So, and there will be a link in the bio.
Well, and I thank you. But there will, at some stage, be a Just Between Us live, where I hope to have William and yes, doing the serious stuff, but also showing him off as a turn, because he is fantastically good. And I'm sure he told you about his techniques at Prime Minister's Questions, or Alistair did, and he talks about the type of questions.
Yeah.
And my favorite was the deep mine question, where out of nowhere, for no reason, completely out of context, he asked Blair whether or not he believed in Father Christmas. Yeah.
Yes, it's a great.
Blair says, "Of course, I don't believe in Father Christmas." He would have, it would have made sense just about in that context. So now he has it on record. So, at a later stage, months and months ahead, William can turn around and say, the Prime Minister has already told the audience that he doesn't believe in Father Christmas. What else has he got to say to the children of the nation as we approach the festival? Whatever. Yeah. And he's just brilliant at that, and his timing is consummate. And he you won't know this. Sadly, very few people know that I stood as an independent for Parliament in 2024.
I did my homework. Yes, you got it. Well, 752 votes, 58 votes.
Actually, 819, but who's counting? The point is, when I left my company, I threw a little party, and William came along and gave a predictably wonderful speech, during which he told me the story of the first election in which he had stood and chatting with the candidate from the Monster Raving Loony Party. Yep. He said, "So what are your campaign promises?" Everybody who says they don't do impressions still thinks they can do an impression of William Hague, and I'm no exception. And so the Monster Raving Loony Party candidate reels off this list of things, pubs staying open as long as they like, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And as William told this beautiful story, he said, and now, he said, 25 years later, almost all those Monster Raving Loony Party pledges have come into law. Yeah. So he's so good at
Well,
taking a funny story from one context and using it in another. His timing is effortless,
yeah.
and he is as good an entertainer, I think, as good an entertainer as any entertainer I've ever seen on a stage.
Well, I would agree. This podcast is more is listened all around the world by people who just want to sort of get tips from people who are in the know, and there's nobody who's seen more great speakers than yourself. The number one fear in the world is public speaking. From everything you've seen, what are the secrets to engaging an audience quickly?
One of the people I've had on Just Between Us, because I know you're interested in funny business people, is he a legend? I think he probably is a legend. Is the legendary Gerald Ratner.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
and people even younger than us, Paul, are aware of the Gerald Ratner story. But just for those who aren't, Gerald Ratner stood up at a huge business gathering at the Albert Hall and called the product that he sold crap. And it was the end of his company, which by the way he's trying to buy back. So the story might have the most wonderful ending, but anyway, and he told a gag. So and it was actually listen to the podcast. Genuinely, listen to the
Oh,
podcast.
I
Okay?
will.
Now I was talking to your own legion of listeners, far greater than mine, all over the world, because he tells a story that he had told this gag many times before. It had even been commented on in the Financial Times before. Yeah. I don't know if this leads to advice. I don't think it does. I just want to tell the story. Um, so two sort of gags, but the banker was, and I won't make this funny, partly because I don't have that gift, and partly because there's no need to. He said, "We do cut glass sherry decanters with 6 glasses on a silver-plated tray, all for £4.95. People say, 'How can you sell this for such a low price?' I say, 'Cause it's total crap." Okay,
Yeah, I remember it.
and that's a gag. And anyway, so the world for him caved in. But there is a point in telling you this, okay? Because outside of gags or constructed gags, Gerald, he's not funny in every respect. I'm sure if I thought about it, I could come up with many, many more examples of business people who are funny. But there's one line that Gerald always used to use in his speeches afterwards, which is, as you will guess, how I got to know him well. So he tells this story, and he says, and overnight, he said, I lost £1 billion, which in those days was a lot of money.
It's a
And
great gag.
that's a line from heaven, isn't it? I
Oh,
mean, it's just a gorgeous line. And if you get the timing right, which I didn't, but I wasn't that far off, you can
it was good.
easily see how the audience is gonna, they are gonna collapse laughing. And if they don't laugh at that, then I guess my advice would be to give up. Get off stage as soon as you can, because this is an audience that doesn't want to laugh.
So it's the same way when we were at school and a supply teacher came in, we could smell the fear. And an audience wants to know that I've got this. You're in good hands.
I'll give you a fantastic example of that. And it's probably the riskiest opening I have ever seen from a stand-up. And it requires an enormous amount of bottle and self-confidence and the ability to take risks. And it was a guy who most people won't have heard of, called Terry Alderton.
I remember.
Um,
Yes, of
who
course.
some people will know because he went off and for a while was in EastEnders. He's a lovely chap, Terry.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the line, but great room, Grosvenor House.
Mm.
A lot of your listeners will be very familiar with it. In my day, it was known alongside the Glasgow Empire as the Mausoleum of Comedy. For quite interesting historical reasons, actually. Because, as you probably know, they used to have a hydraulic dance floor, which everybody wanted to use, which meant that it had to be kept clear, which meant that your audience facing you from the stage was a long way away because you had this fucking hydraulic dance floor in between you and them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And on a busy night, you'd have people up on the balcony around you. And, you know, the room it's a squeeze. It's actually quite unpleasant, but it can take about 1,300 people.
Yeah.
And Terry opened one night, probably an award ceremony, I can't remember. And he opened, and the thing about award ceremonies is that they're really there for only one reason, which is themselves. The thought that they might have won an award and or the thought of getting a better job. And they're really not interested in anything you put on a stage to entertain them. Terry walks out. He turns around. He's looking at the set behind him. And he starts talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't raise his voice. And he's saying, well, that's interesting. I wonder what that means. Or whatever, you know, a funny line. But at more or less this kind of pitch. And this audience, almost all of whom hadn't heard of him, almost all of whom didn't give a damn what was happening on stage. Suddenly, because he opened with it, thought, well, subconsciously, they wouldn't have thought this through deliberately. Something's happening. I suppose we better pay attention. Let's give him, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 seconds. And because of the way he opened and forced them to listen, he absolutely had them. And it was absolute genius. And if I tried to do it, and in a very different context, I think I probably have tried to do it and failed. You have to have that talent, which I certainly don't have. And you have to have that bottle, and you have to have the ability to get out there knowing, believing that it will work, but knowing that it might not. And if a business person having to make a speech at least understands that and has an equivalent, but maybe not at that extreme, then that's a fucking great starting point.
Well, I agree. I can't remember the name of the play. It was 2 words. But John Malkovich was in the West End. He started and he did the first 3 minutes with his back to the audience.
Yeah.
And it was magnetic. You were just drawn to it but it's that kind of bravery as well is an extraordinary thing. And I think that bravery is one of those things. I mean, of course, everybody says that, you know, the biggest fear is public speaking, and everybody's already going, you're brave. But you have to be brave and take it to another level and go, your attitude has to be right, your state has to be right, and then the audience will come to you.
But what's happening now, because of risk aversion, because of fear, because of working from home, because of the way we communicate, often by email rather than by phone or face to face, is that we are becoming, more and more like robots at exactly the time that robots are becoming more and more like human beings. Yes, we're moving in opposite directions, and the result is not good, my friends.
No, but I mean, gosh, we should have that writ large everywhere. That's exactly what's happening. But we are becoming like I work and do some pro bono mentoring for young people and everything. And it's always like a revelation to them when I say, they go, "Oh, I've sent an email to somebody and they haven't got back to me." And I went, "Well, have you tried picking up the phone and having a conversation?" And they look at me and go, "Oh, oh, oh, I hadn't thought of that." And it's a revelation. Have you tried sort of going for a coffee with them, actually having some kind of proper connection with them? This is, everybody's going to get lost. And I would say I have a 24-year-old son who fortunately is a great, great communicator. But he is the only one of his friends who actually picks up the phone and calls people all the time. And when he started doing it with his friends 10 years ago, they go, "Why are you calling?" And he goes, "Because I want to hear your voice." And it's easier to communicate on that level.
I wasn't expecting to say this, Paul, but he's very lucky to have you as a father.
Well, I'm not sure he'd agree, but
one of them, well, again, for future discussion. I don't want to rabbit on about splintering of society or any of those frankly quite depressing subjects, but it's down to luck, in effect, whether you happen to be born into a family or have friends or have a mentor or have a role model or however it comes about where you learn these things. And maybe, you don't even consciously learn these things. They're blindingly obvious to you. And the rest, the other, I won't put a fraction on it, half, 3/4, 90%, says he, trying to put a fraction on it, who don't understand things like the hierarchy of means of communication. Yeah. With being with somebody, shaking their hand and looking them in the eye at the top, and corresponding by email at the bottom. And the phone is above the email. Just because something has been invented after something else doesn't mean that in every respect it's better than what came before it. And that doesn't make me a dinosaur. I'm not a reactionary. I'm not somebody who wishes the world had stopped at some point in the 1950s. Brackets, although I fucking hate technology, close brackets. I understand progress, but this ain't progress.
Well, by the way, just on the mere fact of nuance, if I send you, let's go back to our previous conversation. If I go back to you with an email that just says "fuck off," you don't know what my tone was. It could have been "fuck off," or it could have been "oh, fuck off."
So when you're selling something, yeah. Sorry, this just reminds me of something that I used to tell people who started in my company. Towards the end, by the way, I wasn't allowed to have anything to do with them, and so one of the things I miss actually from the early days is having that opportunity to open eyes or inculcate
Mentor.
the culture or mentor. It just reminded me of another story. But when you're selling something, in our case, it was talent in a pretty broad definition. How can you sell them somebody, purely by exchange of email? How can you do that? Because when it goes wrong, as in when you make a proposal, you need to know if it doesn't work. You need to know why it isn't working, why they don't like it. And you might possibly, I think there's a tiny chance that you might get an email back saying why they don't like that person. In most cases, you wouldn't. You would just get no, not right, not right for us, or whatever, or nothing, or silence, Compare that to a telephone conversation where you're saying, I don't think I said this very often, by the way, but you're saying, well, how about Boris Johnson? And the person at the other end goes, oh my God, no, we couldn't. No, I mean, the boss would actually hate that. Or, or we can't do such a, that person wouldn't write that in an email. You would never know. So in crude selling terms, you had probably just lost a sale because you never had a reaction from which you could learn anything from the person you're selling to. And the same would go, I suppose, in the context of complaints of so-called customer service. There's an oxymoron if ever there were. You can't expect service, and you can't expect to sell anything unless you can communicate in real time with your voice rather than with a keyboard. End of, period. Now go away.
100%. 100%. And it's the key to everything. And by the way, also, if you don't practice this art or science, it goes. And if there's a generational thing of it disappearing when people are going, no, I've sent him an email and they don't want it. And you go, well, that's not the way the world works. By the way, just from a psychological perspective, we need human interaction. It's built into our DNA. That's how we work. And email's not that. But we're coming to the part of the show which we like to call quick fire questions.
Quick fire questions.
Oh, gosh.
That's the kind of reaction I was hoping for. Who's the funniest business person that you've met?
Oh, fuck. I should have saved the Joel Ratner line, shouldn't I? Maybe the person who now runs my old agency, was a guy called Ellis Watson, who has had lots of jobs. He once sold the rights to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire around the world. He's a genuinely funny person. But if you're listening to this, Ellis, I don't know if you've learnt it since, but certainly when I last saw you get up and make a speech, you didn't know where to draw the fucking line. So he's very funny and sometimes went a little bit too far. Next question. Sorry, I failed at that one.
No, it's very good. What book makes you laugh?
Do you want a pretentious or an unpretentious answer?
I think I'd like both, please, because then we can decide which one we're going to make you look pretentious or unpretentious, depending on if the check arrives.
Good point. And I don't even know where your producer lives. Okay, pretentious answers. I'd probably start with the Canterbury Tales. Hugely funny.
Oh yes.
I'd sidestep Shakespeare, whose comedies, or they're not books, they're plays, but they're not funny anyway, especially the ones called comedies. Lots of 18th century stuff, Tom Jones, Henry Fielding, and then a little bit more recent, pretty much anything by Anthony Trollope. That's a Trollope, rather than Joanna, his dead descendant.
Yes, rather than a load of Trollops.
Exactly. The less pretentious, but still probably a bit pretentious, answer, I suppose, is anything by Howard Jacobson.
There is a book called Seriously Funny right behind me.
Paul, I mean this. My eyesight is shit. I had absolutely no idea of that. It's not, dear listeners, though I can see that in the background.
Yeah.
That wasn't planted, but I'm very pleased we're of the same mind.
Yes, no, it's a great book. He's a wonderful writer and a wonderful wit.
Oh, absolutely. A deeply wonderful man. So there's my answer. Absolutely nothing that you will ever find in the humour section of a bookshop is my answer.
I like it. Or a stocking filler.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Is there a TV show that makes you laugh, Jeremy?
There are some. my favorite sitcom at the moment is not on, sadly. Um, um, and it's Colin from Accounts, the Australian sitcom.
Yes,
Um,
brilliant.
Probably rather weirdly, the phrase is now well known because the Tories stole it to refer to Rachel Reeves as Rachel from Accounts. I doubt whether many Tories have actually watched it. It's extraordinarily biased comment from me there, but nonetheless. But politicians don't watch television. I mean, notoriously, politicians don't watch television. So that I like Amanda Land.
Yes.
There's something online, says he, as somebody who spends. I'm proud when they force you to know how many minutes you've spent doing something. I'm terribly proud whenever that goes down on my screen. But I found something the other day by accident called Puppet Regime, which is a little
yes.
bit like snippets
Spitting image. Yeah.
of Spitting Image. And it genuinely, that makes me laugh. And sometimes other things make me laugh, but I do, I'm that sad git who, the laughing thing, unless I'm taken completely by surprise, which Colin from Accounts does, then I'm anticipating the punchline. I'm not going to laugh. I'm going to smile, and even worse, I'm going to nod, saying, "Oh, yeah, that was frightfully funny, frightfully funny." But occasionally, I don't read newspapers. Sorry, I know I'm going off on this. Is no longer quick fire. I don't read newspapers, but I do look at the BBC News website every day, and therefore the front pages. And The Sun had a wonderful headline last week, and I'm sure they kicked themselves by going early with it, because they actually should have used it today. But they probably thought, oh, this is so clever, we have to use it now before somebody else does. And having built it up to that point, I doubt whether anybody else will find it as funny as I do. But it was a photograph of whatever it's called, HMS Dragon, the ship.
Yeah.
And the big headline, the big banner headline was, "Ship happens." And I just thought, well, I hate you, but that's a fantastic bit of headline writing. So those kind of things make me laugh. Anyway, I'll shut up. Sorry. Moving on.
Well, no. Okay. What word makes you laugh, Jeremy?
Mandelson.
Sorry, that just slayed me there. And are you using it as a noun or a verb?
Well, I don't know, an ex-noun. You could easily see it becoming a verb, couldn't you? Anyway, yes, that word makes me laugh.
Well, taking a shift to the other side, what's not funny?
Ooh. Apart from a lot of people. Actually, I'll tell you something. My podcast, I don't know if we've mentioned my podcast before. My podcast, shut up, Jeremy. I know. My podcast,
between us, we might have mentioned
exactly.
it.
Don't tell anyone. It's all about having a very broad variety of guests, some of whom are comics. Yeah. They do, by the way, seeing as I've mentioned it, do listen to Harry Enfield. That if you want to
I have. It's brilliant.
That was me laughing genuinely. And my producer was in the side of the room trying as hard as he possibly could to muffle her laughs. That's laughing genuinely. But some
40, and you've known him for 45 years, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I made the mistake of starting that because I thought, fucking hell, it really is 45 years since we got to know each other. Anyway, so some of these episodes are not expected to be funny. Yeah. They're not with comedians or blah, blah, blah. But I am taken aback, and it's happened. I mean, it happened once this season. I think it's only happened once, actually. When I suddenly realized that this person in front of me, in this particular occasion, it was Bronwyn Maddox, who runs Chatham House. I suddenly thought, oh my God, you don't have a sense of humour. You, there's nothing I can do. Even at the end, where, in a desperate attempt to lighten the mood, I said, and it wasn't just about lightening the mood, by the way, it was, chasing insights and revelations. I was getting absolutely nowhere. At the end, I said, what are you off to do now, Bronwyn? And she said, I'm going to the market. I said, oh, what are you looking to buy? And she said, crisps. And she said, crisps for a party I'm going to have. How do you react to that? Which is terribly funny, but not funny.
Yeah.
So what's not funny in my mind at the moment is Bronwyn Maddox. Send your letters of complaint via Paul Bross. Sorry, let's move on. Next question, if there is one.
Okay. Wait, okay, then I'll just throw one in then. What sound makes you laugh? Is there a sound that makes you laugh?
Well, it's not the sounds that are routinely, I don't know if they still are, used on sitcoms and things like, belching and farting and those kind of things. No, those things have never, ever made me laugh. It's quite fun. Actually, a sound has just started, which is the alarm on my radio. So I have occasionally laughed during the course of recording my podcast when Sydney, my dog, starts barking. So that's one thing. I sort of made myself laugh when I had invited people around to dinner, and shortly before they arrived, all the smoke alarms went off. So that's another sound where I tried to find it funny. And, this is where time is a great healer. Yeah. Within, 5-10 years, I will find that funny.
It's the old gag, isn't it? My wife's not a great cook. She uses the smoke alarm as a timer.
I mean, I don't have a wife, but nothing's to stop me borrowing that line. Thank you very much.
Exactly, man. That works. Penultimate question. Would you rather be considered clever or funny?
Oh, I'm just happy to be considered.
Perfect. And finally, Jeremy, desert island gags. If you could only take one joke with you to a desert island, what would that be?
Wow. That's a tricky one, Paul, not least because I'm a dreadful, dreadful gag teller. I mean, I really am. All right, I'll tell you, unsurprisingly, I'll tell you what I have always known as a Jewish gag. And you'll be familiar with this gag. And everybody has their own version of the gag. So, as a Jewish man on his deathbed, and his wife is next to him on his deathbed, and he reaches out his hand, and he says, Miriam, I said, you've always been by my side, Miriam. When our families had to escape the Nazis, when we started in this country with nothing, I said, you were with me. When we had to close the shop, when the factory burned down, you were there. When everyone got food poisoning at the bar mitzvah, when our beloved daughter married out, even when I fell over in the street the other day, you were next to me. She looks at him with a tear in her eye. And he says, you know something, Miriam? He said, you're a bloody jinx.
It's a great gag.
Thank you for laughing politely.
No, it's not a polite laughter, and I thought it was actually beautifully told. The build was beautiful.
I would be terrified of telling that in public, which I suppose is exactly what I've done. So I do apologize. Your producer might want to take that out, but that's my offering.
No, it's staying in, and I thank you for staying in with us on the Humourology podcast and being the best Jewish COV agnostic guest that we've ever had on.
You need to invite Hugo Rifkin. Sorry to talk over you.
Jeremy Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a genuine pleasure. It really has.
The Humourology Podcast was hosted by Paul Barros. Produced by David Rose. Music by Steve Hayworth. Creative direction by Les Hughes. And additional research by Helen Sykes. Please remember to subscribe, like, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. This has been a Big Sky production.